Okay, hello and welcome to the Depth and Conversation podcast. I'm Ryan, and we have a very special guest with us today, Tom Murray. And I would like to just briefly introduce Tom with this short bio that I'm going to read. So, Dr. Tom Murray is a senior research fellow in the computer science department at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which, funny enough, I just have to mention that my mother actually got a master's degree from the computer science department at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, same college, same department. Currently, his primary research is in supporting social deliberative skills in online contexts. He has done research in the areas of cognitive tools, adaptive computer learning environments, online collaboration, ethics, and knowledge engineering. He publishes scholarly papers in the field of integral theory, epistemology, and applied philosophy. Murray has degrees in educational technology, computer science, and physics. He is on the editorial review boards of two international journals, the International Journal of Artificial Intelligence in Education, and at Integral Review as an associate editor. So that is a little bit about the great Tom Murray, and I'm really honored to be talking with you. This is so cool. And so my particular interest in talking to you is mostly in integral theory and the extensions of integral theory that you've been working on. And so if you all out there don't know what integral theory is, Ken Wilber's philosophical system, I'm going to provide some links in the description of the video so that you can get some background knowledge. We will assume a little bit of basic familiarity with integral theory in this conversation. And we're going to use that as a foundation and launch off into some really interesting, very deep, perhaps slightly intellectual, but also hopefully practical places. And so if you need to freshen up your basic understanding of integral theory, I invite you to do that first. Okay. And so I kind of want to start with someone named Terri O'Fallon, who has taken Ken Wilber's work and expanded it in a new direction, and I think also probably would be fair to say synthesized in other people's work and also some really scientific research, it seems like, and like sort of rigorous statistical analysis and that kind of thing. And so Terri O'Fallon has sort of a new model that we call the stages model that sort of maps human development and consciousness. And so my understanding is that, Tom, you're a fan of Terri O'Fallon's work. You work with that model, and I'm guessing that you probably see it as maybe an important addition or improvement to basic integral theory. Is that true?
Yes, certainly. Yes, definitely. I see it particularly as an advance in the world of adult developmental theories. So, when we look at Wilbur's work, I like to summarize it in terms of the basic components that it offers. One of them is a philosophical framework for holism that is particularly rigorous. So you've got the 4 quadrants and the 8 zones, and so that's a philosophical framework for what exists in the world and the perspective you can take and the kinds of methodologies we can use for inquiring into all kinds of stuff. And so that's sort of like rigorous holism is one part of integral theory, and the other thing is that everything it talks about, it laces in some kind of narrative about development or evolution. So those are kind of how I tend to describe, just in a couple of sentences, the two components or offerings in integral theory. And I'm mostly work in the area of the second one. And you could say that even within that theme of development and evolution, there's you could sort of divide that again to say that some of the theories, such as spiral dynamics, and I see you've got the chart on the wall behind you, speak more to sort of social and cultural issues.
Yes.
And those are frames that those of us sort of in the community lean on and love to use, and they're great models for understanding what's going on, but they're not particularly strongly based in empirical research. So as far as we know, we could just be, meaning making and confirmation biasing our way and just kind of projecting this model out into the world. And it's a great model to help make sense of what's going on out there. But the more rigorous work is with the psychological research on just, individual adults and adult development. So that thread starts all the way back with Piaget and Baldwin and people earlier than that, and continues on through Levenger's work is kind of the basis of the ego development assessment, which Wilbur also refers to heavily in terms of the work of Suzanne Cook-Reuter. So Suzanne Cook-Reuter and Bill Torbert are the two people that kind of took Levenger's ego development framework and kind of brought it into the modern world more. And so that was very influential to Wilbur's work. And Terri is building on top of Suzanne's work. So a long way of saying what, so and what Terri did was she used some inspirations from Wilbur's quadrant theory to marry that with Suzanne's developmental framework and come up with something new and that has a lot of really wonderful features that we could talk about. Yeah.
Great.
So, and I'm involved in, helping Terri do the research on that model in the last 4 or 5 years. So Terri does a lot of the qualitative research, and I've been doing most of the quantitative research on the sort of psychometrics of that model for the last few years. And also helping with, you've read some of the other stuff that I have out there. There's other more kind of theoretical things that I like to play around also that are not just about assessment.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for clarifying the sort of lineage and history there. I had a sense that there was more complexity than just, like Wilbur to Terri O'Fallon is probably not nearly as informative as the entire history you laid out. So that's great. And and just very briefly, I want to mention to the audience, because it may not be clear like what kind of research is unfolding. Like my understanding is that what you all have been doing is sort of a lot of analysis of like sentence completion tests where, the test will start a sentence and you will finish it in a sort of open-ended way. So it's not like multiple choice. But then you're using, I think, I don't know, you'll have to help me out here, but you're using some kind of AI to then analyze the open-ended responses, and that somehow becomes like scientific and quantifiable in a way that you can actually do statistics with it. Is that right?
Well, not exactly, but let's look at all those pieces. So we have this field that we call the adult development, which is, kind of for some people, striking idea or discovery that we keep developing in maturity and wisdom past the age of 20 or 25, which kind of when the classical theories of cognitive development would say that people kind of reach their peak, or 20s. So we're looking at how adults develop in wisdom, or sometimes it's called like leadership maturity, depending on kind of what the audience is, and sometimes it's called spiritual intelligence, because the models that we have show that as people develop in the later stages, it starts to look a little more like spiritual wisdom than a kind of cognitive or just simply perspective taking. So within this general field of how do adults develop, kind of their complexity of their thinking and the depth of their thinking, and by complexity I mean like the ability to like put lots of different things together or take many perspectives, and it's kind of like moving away from black and white thinking towards being able to hold a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fluidity,
subtlety, nuance.
Subtlety and nuance.
It's contradiction. Yeah.
And then there's depth, which is kind of your self-understanding of, and it's also, you could say, kind of an understanding of human nature and the human condition. And so those things, kind of complexity and depth, kind of come together into what we call ego development, and what Keegan calls meaning-making maturity. So those people who are familiar with Robert Keegan's work, it's also kind of very, very similar to Cook-Rader's and O'Fallon's ego development models. But all these there's a bunch of different frameworks out there for measuring this adult development or wisdom maturity kind of thing, and they all use different measurements. And so even though the basic principles for kind of understanding how we develop are very similar, the assessments can be very different. So the least rigorous ones look something like a multiple choice test, like you might take some tests to show where you are in the Myers-Briggs or personality test, and it gives you 10 or 20 multiple choice questions. And those are sort of questionable value for those of us that, that work in really high quality assessments, because it's often easy to tell like which is the right answer or which, you're kind of marking what you would like to be rather than what you are, so to speak.
Yeah.
So the sentence completion test is 36 sentence stems that you complete, and there are things like the thing I like about myself is blank, rules are blank, my family blank, when people step out of line blank. So, and they sort of come in and triangulate from all different aspects of life, work and family and personal growth and things like that. And so it takes a highly, and it's there are no right answers. It's kind of like it's called a projective test. It's like a Rorschach test. People just put out there whatever comes to mind, and it takes you have to train for about a year to be able to be a scorer. Turn all this text into the final score and analysis that we give people. So, and because it's a projective test, like a Rorschach test, the scorer, the analyst, can see a little more deeply into what's going on with that person and things that person may not actually see themselves. So they can get a lot of insight about themselves in the course of this report, and then a counseling debriefing session comes after that, and a coaching session comes after that.
Very cool. And so is it sort of after that point, like once a human has analyzed the responses, then you can kind of do statistics and science with it? No?
Yes. So so mostly, I would say most of the people that take these kinds of assessments are doing it for their own personal reasons, for like personal growth or executive leadership things, and they are used just to gain insight on yourself, kind of what your leading edge is, and your struggles and your strengths and weaknesses, and but of course also these kinds of assessments can be used for research and more large scale statistical things. So so there's a lot of studies like that in the whole Lovinger tradition, and we participated in some of those types of studies as well. So in order to make them less expensive, and more like something you can actually do with 100 or 1,000 people, there's two things we can do. One is we've developed a fast human scoring method that we've been prototyping over the last year that cuts the cost and time down by quite a bit, and it's still pretty reliable. And then also I put together with some colleagues of mine a machine learning AI scoring system that looks at the text, and that is less accurate than human scoring. So it's got a larger margin of error. So we can use that to do some of these statistical results as well. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense now. Gotcha. And so the AI version, what would you say that is it good enough to be a practical tool in research right now, or are you more researching, developing the AI?
Yeah, no, we've used it in a bunch of research projects and some.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah.
Some PhD dissertation people have come to us and used it for that.
Wow.
We're part of a really interesting study from UC Davis. This professor there, Martin Hilbert, is doing this big study on people's susceptibility to being biased by the media. So coming out of this, the whole frame of we're in this place now we call the meaning crisis, and it's we're being like influenced by all the social media and stuff like that. So he ran a study last year where they have various ways of testing if people are easily influenced by being manipulated in different ways in social media. And then he also gave the subjects a number of tests, and the stages. Ego development test is one of them, and also personality test and other kinds of tests that he gave. And so they're in the middle of the data analysis for that now, to just kind of say, he's very interested in consciousness, whatever that is. So whether like higher consciousness or higher wisdom, which can be measured in various ways, and he's trying to measure whether that creates more resistance to being biased by these kinds of things. So that'll be a very interesting study when the results are out.
Yeah, fascinating. I could definitely. Oh, sorry, what was that?
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that the AI scoring is set up to do. And he has 1,000. He had 1,000 participants in that study, so it's a big chunk of data.
Yeah, super cool. And I could totally imagine the connection there between, like, if you're presented with one perspective, what is your ability like to question one narrative, or then to take many perspectives that might have an influence on how you see the first perspective. And those kind of skills make a lot of sense in terms of ego development. Awesome. So I'd like to pivot the conversation now, maybe away from the research side of things and into your philosophical views and writings, and maybe some of your sort of forthcoming writings that I got a chance to read. I think they're not quite published yet, but I got a chance to dig into them. And I was very curious to see, I think the place I want to start with is this notion that we have constructive development, where we're adding complexity to our models of life, and we have deconstructive, or sort of releasing type development, where we are sort of correcting, you could maybe call them mistakes of earlier decisions in our development, or dealing with the trauma that we accumulated earlier in development. And I think the deconstructing, releasing arc of the development process would also be associated with shadow work. Am I right so far? Kind of just describing this accurately?
Yeah, that's
Okay, good. And so that's not an idea that's unique to your views at all. Like many people have sort of worked with that sort of a concept that there's like a building up complexity and there's a releasing complexity. Now, something that you said specifically in your writings a few times is you really emphasized the deconstructive movement and the sort of shadow work side of things. And I believe you said something to the effect of like the greater share of the work is in the deconstructive side of things. And so I'm curious, I'm curious about that. I'm curious why you would say that and why that seems to be the case to you. Like how do you arrive at the conclusion that the greater share of work is on the deconstructive side?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. So where to start here? So within the sort of larger community of people who are interested in human development and the consciousness evolution, there are different, you can sort of pick out different strands. And for some of them, increasing development is more like increasing complexity. And for some of them, it feels more like a spiritual thing where you're getting more and more spiritual towards some kind of awakening or something. And for some, it's a lot of it is about the shadow work, like finding your true authentic self and getting rid of the baggage in the way there. And I'm trying to create a framework that integrates those different movements, and they all acknowledge each other in some way or other, but I'm working on a framework that tries to do that at a more formal level, or like building up from basics kind of thing. So I am so I have various kinds of life experiences that are about working with shadow work and that kind of personal healing, and I have other experiences, in contemplative practice and spiritual side and interest in those places. But really, where I'm coming from as a theorist or a scholar is the developmental side. And so it's kind of mostly speaking to that community when I write, and within that community, and this includes the integral folks as well. And nowadays we have the metamodern community and the liminal web community and all of that kind of in that umbrella that Bonnie Royce calls the integral diaspora. I like that term. There's a large emphasis on this idea of development as just going up this ladder, even though we are usually clear to say that's really not what we want to do. It's like push people up a ladder. And our community is very good about talking about the importance of shadow work. And, Wilbur kind of got us going in that direction with his additions to transpersonal psychology. But still we think of the shadow work side as kind of like, oh, here's some techniques you can use. And it's kind of this big amorphous bag. This is your shadow work. You got to deal with it, and those pathologies and all of that. And then we can get back to our vertical growth. And also within that community, there is a strong narrative that uses, the term VUCA. Have you heard of?
In like a Buddhist sense? Like dukkha as in... Oh, okay.
So the saying is, we live in a VUCA world, which is a world that's full of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I think those are the words.
Now I remember. Yeah.
The world's getting more complex and things are changing faster, and we have to increase our complexity to deal with all this complexity. So that's true enough. But there's something, if that's kind of your focus, there's something a little off about that, at least for some of us. because we know that lots of really complex thinkers who don't feel like they're going in the right direction, and you could make the argument that a lot of the problems that society and culture have gotten themselves into is because of types of complexity that we've layered on that we haven't had to. So when I look out at the world, or any culture, or even any organization or any family, and say, like, look at the tensions and the suffering that's happening. I don't come away saying these people need to be more complex. I come away thinking that it's the shadow work, that needs to get done to sort of return people to their basic goodness, something like that. So, so that's kind of a long way to answer, like, how. That's just when I look out at the world. That's not. I don't kind of. Occasionally, well, maybe 40% of the time, 30% of the time, I'm thinking, wow, this situation needs more organization and more complexity and more perspective taking. But more often, it's just like people's, the personal wounds and the attachment theory kinds of stuff, and the cultural shadows and all of that are what's really needs to be looked at. And there's a whole community of people in modern trauma theory who are looking at that kind of stuff at individual and collective levels. So what I'm trying to do is do a better integration of these developmental theories that kind of are about increasing with the theories of healing and release and restoration and recovery that are the descending. So yeah, I could say more about exactly how I'm trying to do that, but and in the process of tying all that together, it also clarifies some things about spiritual growth, because in narratives of spiritual growth, we often put things at the top which are really about recovering, primordial resources that are at the bottom, so to speak, of the development journey.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. Yeah, so I would like to delve more into how you're approaching the shadow work side of things, and maybe get into like, what can we do about the need for more shadow work and for more deconstructive healing. I was looking through one section of your writings. You describe, I think, 5 different sort of cognitive errors that you can make along the journey. And I'm not going to go through them comprehensively, but these were things like composition, where you see a pattern that's not there, or various kinds of mental separation, where by separating 2 things, you stop focusing on the connection between them, and that is an important loss of information, and various things like that. And so that got me thinking about something, which is that, like, in meditative traditions, or like in Buddhism, that kind of thing, there's some amount of focus on the ability to turn off your mind, like to stop thinking. And if you could have that kind of control, that's sort of seen as beneficial. And in some sense, that seems like it would be aligned with the deconstructive movement. You're like releasing complexity then, if you're not thinking. But at the same time, you're not actually correcting an error. Like, there isn't a specific error that you said, oh, I thought about it this way, and now I could think about it differently because I realized I was not including the right information, or my mental map was flawed in some way. And I could think of other examples where there's this sort of like turning off kind of ability that could be helpful. Like, another example that comes to mind is with one's relationship to power. And I would say that in studying integral theory and learning about, let's say, like the level of red, and learning to integrate that into a sort of whole and inclusive psyche, I am somewhat embracing of power. Like, I think power has an upside. That means that you can influence the world in positive ways. And yet I could also see how like an overfixation on power would be harmful, right? Just like a repression of power could also be harmful. And so in that sense, having some sort of an ability to like turn off your strong desires or to turn off your fixation on power might then bring you into balance. But again, this is sort of like turning off something or removing an intention more than it is actually like correcting a map. And so I'm curious if you see these sorts of turning off mechanisms as part of the deconstructive movement. Is it similar to the 5 cognitive errors? Is it like a different category? Like, how do you see the sort of turning off mechanisms fitting into this picture?
Let's see. That's a great question. There's a lot in there. So I guess I'll say a little bit about those 5 mechanisms first.
Okay.
Just that. So I said before that, so the developmental community has some very good models of the ascending path of development, and using these ideas of like differentiate, how does it work through differentiation and integration that kind of coalesces around different levels that you can identify, and lots of research on this, on how people grow in these wisdom skills. But the descending path, like I said, is just kind of this bag of shadow stuff that you're supposed to deal with. And it turns out that you can be more precise about the shadow stuff by actually matching it to the developmental sequence. So the idea is, if you're going to deconstruct some shadow or heal it, what level does it come from? You know, where was it created? If anything you're going to take apart is something that was created at some point. So what level was it created? And that can make a difference to how you approach the healing or deconstructing or releasing of that. And so how can we have the cleanest, most precise theory of development that's out there is Michael Common's hierarchical complexity theory, and it boils down all of development to a very simple idea, and it's just that when one thing organizes or operates on other things, then you have a new level. So, you know, you've got riding a bike, you've got a steer, and you've got a pedal, and you've got a balance, and all of these things, and then they come together. Something organizes them into one thing that flows. So we use that kind of just a very simple idea of when one thing operates on a bunch of different things. That's called development. So my question, it's a very simple idea that is kind of the foundation that explains everything that develops. It's very kind of pure principle. Can we have something like that for the deconstructive paths? Is kind of what I'm asking. You know, kind of like just some foundational principles that are kind of like cognitive mechanisms. So what I did was I looked at Common's theory and a bunch of other theories of cognitive development, and this thing, like, there are different ways that something can operate on and create like a higher level. So, and those are the things that you talked about. So there's things like composition and abstraction and transcending, and I forgot what the 5 are right now, but so I looked at a bunch of theories, and basically you can say that they all point to these 5 things in different languages and different ways. And then I looked at each of those. So now we have 5 different processes that together or even separately work to create any kind of development that you would want to talk about, any kind of personal or cognitive growth that you would want to talk about, where something is building on something else. And I looked at each of those and showed how there's a downside to each one of those very specifically. There's a downside to abstraction, to transcendence, to composition, as you started to mention, and that's in one of the paper drafts. And so what that says is that at a more precise level, there's always a downside to development. So another way of thinking about this is, development from the very beginning, from birth, is just building these structures. You can think of it like a brain with neurons and things that are kind of linking up, and some of them are operating on and looking at other things. It's top down and bottom up, but there's a hierarchy in there. And anytime you build so what I'm gonna do now is sort of deconstruct this narrative that we have in the integral community that uses this phrase transcend and include. Okay, so that's all. It kind of permeated with a lot of our little subculture. This idea of that growth is about transcend and include. And that if it doesn't transcend and include, it's somehow kind of pathological or shadow, or kind of put off to the side and we'll deal with it. But my argument is that we always transcend and exclude. So that whenever you build a new structure in your consciousness, that structure is solving some problem, and it's saying, do it this way. This links to this. So when you have this input, you associate it with this. So you have this output, or this feeling comes up, or this reaction. And so it's some kind of a stable pattern. And if you've learned it, that means it's stable, so it's gotten in there and it's a stable structure. So when you have a stable structure, it's great. You can build things on top of it. You can rely on it. But it's telling you that things have to be done in a certain way. There's certain associations, like, I associate women with caretaking, and it's probably a good thing for some part of life, but it doesn't totally generalize. So every structure hides something, or leaves something out, or pushes something away, or says you have to do it this way. It puts it in a box. So every structure transcends and it excludes, it leaves something behind. So through the entire process of human development, we're building these structures and leaving things behind. And every structure will at some point, which we say could at some point, show itself to be a limitation instead of a strength. Okay, so a shadow structure is just any structure that we have that is no longer useful to us. It was useful to us when we learned it. Maybe it helped us through our dysfunctional family, or maybe it helped culture get from A to B or whatever, or helped us fit into the culture. But if you keep growing and trying to expand your perspective taking and your inclusion of different, marginal realities and other aspects of the world, you'll run into the fact that this structure is no longer serving you. And that's true for all structures. So the developmental process should always be this process of building and then keep checking and deconstructing, because you run into these problems. So it's a continuous process. So all of that is just a way to sort of more formally argue for the importance of these deconstructive releasing moves, where you're releasing complexity. So to release complexity doesn't mean that you get rid of the structure. It means that you release its hold on you. So you see through it. Okay. So, if I associate women with like caretaking instead of seeing them as like full like partners in life or something, and then I somehow deconstruct that and heal through it, and I'm beyond it. It's that part of me is still kind of, I can still touch into that old way that I used to feel, and it comes up sometimes. And so, we don't tend to totally get rid of things, but we release their grip on us, the fact that we have to do it that way, and we can only see the world in that way, and that those structures will filter what, they filter color the information that we perceive. So we kind of move beyond them in that sense. So so part of the model is that there are better and worse times to deconstruct certain things, and the lower in the psychic developmental stack you go and start deconstructing things, the more you're destabilizing everything that's built on top, and the more kind of serious of a deconstruction or reconstruction it is, and the more careful you want to be.
Yeah.
So that leads into all kinds of conversations about what kinds of practices target what levels of the psychic structure, and when is the appropriate time to bring in some psychotherapy or meditation or drugs or something that starts to loosen those structures. You don't want to loosen a structure that's when you don't have something underneath it that is a stronger substructure. And that substructure could be just simply like a clear knowledge that I am safe in the world, or that I'm a good person. That's a very deep, that's healthy infants are born with that. If you don't have touch with the deeper substructure, then another example that people say is you don't want to deconstruct your ego until you have a healthy ego, right? So again, it's like there's like this nuancing of when the deconstruction happens. So to get to your question about turning things off, that gets a little bit into the differentiation between states and stages.
Yeah.
So in this, Wilbur started this conversation, and it also draws from a lot of contemporary cognitive science, and Terri O'Fallon's model also clarifies this beyond what Wilbur articulated. But basically, a state is, a state is an experience you have, and if you keep repeating it, you get a stage, basically, right?
Yeah.
So if you're meditating and you turn off your thoughts, that's a state experience, first of all. So if you so the ascending process has a certain logic to it, which involves differentiation, which is you actually see new things. It's like, oh, there's that and there's that. It used to be just one big mush before, and now I see, and then there's many of these things, and you start to coordinate them into a new understanding, a new worldview, and they sort of come together, they sort of integrate. And then actually what happens is once they integrate and become kind of a normal part of your life, they sink into the unconscious and become, stable structures that just feel normal. You don't even know anymore that you're doing them. And then there's the possibility of further levels, which is once you have a structure, you can, and it's in your unconscious, and you kind of even don't remember how you do it anymore. You just do it. Then you can go back in and use awareness to understand what's going on with that structure that you've already had. Okay. I don't know if it's a great idea to use kind of this penetrating awareness on a structure that you're in the process of building, because, it'll get in the way of the learning process and the process of making it automatic and into the unconscious. But at some point, let's say you become a great tennis player, in other words, if you think too hard about that tennis swing, you're going to miss it, right? So you're not deconstructing while you're doing it. Someone shows you all the pieces, and and you're doing a lot of thinking, and then you start learning, and you're putting it together, and you stop thinking, and you just practice, and then you're a tennis player. And for most tennis players, they really can't explain very well to somebody. You're not a great tennis teacher just because you're a tennis player. So then but once you are an expert, then you can go back and with awareness practices, see how things are constructed. And then you can do things like teach that thing. You can also, that's where, and lead, you can do kind of leadership in different ways because you understand more about how it works. And hopefully, how it works in other people too. And you can also innovate. So it's like, I'm going to create a new kind of tennis swing or a new kind of tennis game. And the fourth thing you can do is deconstruct and look at that thing in a larger context and say, is this really, is this really serving me now? And is it time to let go of things? So the deconstructive process, I said the constructive process has a kind of logic or mechanism that we sort of understand, and the deconstructive process does too. If you look at the trauma literature, it involves. So basically, the deconstructive process is about bringing awareness to structures that you already have. Okay, so in this way, development is neither about the ascending building up of structures, nor is it only about sort of the descending process. It's more about what I call the volume between the two. So kind of like the more we develop in maturity or wisdom or spirituality, the deeper we have to go in connecting with our deepest resources and deconstructing the filters and things that we use in the world. So there's kind of this, the sort of wisdom and spiritual journey is both up and down, and that's what makes ego development different than just cognitive development. So you can keep increasing in complexity, but if you don't take that complex mind and turn it in to do that kind of subject object move and look at yourself, you're not doing ego development, and you can keep getting meta more complex, and you can write books and theories, but you might still have little insight in how you show up for your family and your colleagues, because you haven't done the personal deconstruction work. So that's kind of a volume thing, and that's all right. So turning off. Sorry, this turned into like long answers, but so
it's okay.
If you're turning off, the first thing you're doing is you're stopping the chatter and everything that's going to get in the way of you actually bringing awareness to something new. Okay, so that's an important step. Then, as you know, in contemplative practice, there are different tools for being able to focus and also being able to have open awareness. So you have to sort of build up some cognitive strength to be able to focus and bracket out the stuff that you don't want to be there. But then you start sinking more into an open awareness, and that involves just the process of being aware of what comes up. So in the deconstructive process, the more you can see and feel, this is actually a whole body understanding. If you can feel how the parts of something come together to result in your experience or your conclusion or yourself or your perception, just the process of seeing and sort of bringing the tentacles of awareness into the parts of themselves. You see, if someone's wearing this kind of clothing and they say something like this, I get threatened. And you see the parts, you see the relationship and the whole path. And then it just there's just something about, I think, how the mind works and how healing works is it starts to loosen. You're bringing like the healing medicine of awareness into this place. So that involves just really, different practices, lots of different practices you can bring, but that's a general principle of you get rid of the debris of everyday life so you can focus. Then you open up and you see what arises. And then you just look ever more closely until you notice the parts and how the parts are related and how they give rise to the experience that you normally have. And that process itself is, does a lot of the release. Now, once there's a release, in other words, you no longer have to think of the world in a particular way. So that does two things. It gives you access to things that you might have blocked before. So, if I'm doing some kind of psychological healing with my relationship with my parents or my mom, once that starts to heal, I might get more in touch with my own feminine side. I might get more open to my connections with different people in the world who are more feminine. So different possibilities open up. In other words, when these structures go away, possibilities open up, and from all those possibilities, then you reconstruct. So that's an important part of it. Is now there's all this new information, and then you're on the ascending journey again. You're sort of putting it together in a new way of understanding. So there's kind of this relationship between the ascending and descending there. Is that?
Yeah, well, this is complicated and deep stuff, but I think there is an answer in there. Well, there's an answer to a lot of things, but to sort of sum up my original question, it sounds like you can use state-oriented practices like meditation to cultivate a spaciousness that could facilitate shadow work because you're actually learning more about your own structures, and that would allow you to deconstruct them as they arise into awareness. Does that sound about right?
Yes, and the state, yeah, and the deconstructive processes also need practice. So there's the state, and then in all kinds of development, it starts with sort of fleeting state experiences, but then you start to have more control over like creating those state experiences, and they happen more and more quickly in your day-to-day life. So so eventually what you might realize about yourself, or say your thought pattern in a meditation, or the next day you have a conversation with somebody and then you're like, oh, that was, I was back in that pattern again. At first you won't recognize it even when someone tells it to you, and then you recognize it when someone tells it to you with a little resistance, and then you recognize it when someone tells it to you with more openness, and then you recognize it yourself after, and then you get closer and closer and closer until you recognize it as it arises. You can just like, I'm about to get defensive again, and you release it, and at that point you've really internalized whatever that thing is that you're healing and releasing. So that's also, this sort of turning off is something we can do in a contemplative practice, but like all state experiences, if we keep practicing them, you'll bring some aspect of that kind of stillness into the momentary. Yeah.
Cool. Very cool. All right. I feel like you've kind of painted a picture of how to approach shadow work plus a a joined constructive development at the same time, at least in general terms, which is really cool. There's one specific point that I really want us to talk about before we maybe move into like a closing. And that is this concept that you touched upon a while ago, which is that as you develop in the ascending direction, so as you develop in greater and greater complexity, you become capable of doing deconstructive healing work at lower and lower levels, because those lower and lower levels are more and more destabilizing and challenging to deal with. And so I think maybe some examples of this would be like, I'm gonna return to Wilbur's model because it's what I know the best. So when you're at Orange, you're learning a lot about rational thinking, and then when you're at Green, you're able to sort of deconstruct rational thinking. But then beyond Green, we're maybe more interested in deconstructing eventually social roles, and then eventually we're going to deconstruct very fundamental things like sensory perceptions and the sense of self as an ego. And these are some things that contemplative practice deals with. So I think that's a fascinating concept. And as far as I understand it, this is sort of, well, as far as I know, it's a unique contribution that you're offering. I haven't heard anybody else lay this out like that. It's very interesting, and it sort of paints like a symmetrical picture that you're like moving in this way, and then you're also traveling further in this direction at the same time, which is super cool. So I'm excited by that idea. It also makes me think, is that the only thing that's happening? Because I'm also thinking that you can only deconstruct something once you've constructed it. And so that means that there's a new opportunity to deconstruct things that you've recently constructed. And so from that lens, you might think that you would actually also sort of focus on more recent constructions in your shadow work. And I thought of a couple potential examples where it sort of seems to move in the other direction. Like when people are thinking about releasing their attachment to ego, I think it sort of, this is, at least resonates with my personal experience. It's easiest to become non-attached in a positive sense to like your body, to say, well, I'm more than my body. I don't have to be exclusively attached to being a body. And it's a little more challenging to detach from your emotions and to have freedom from them, and to say, well, I can be not completely controlled by my emotions, even though they're there. And I feel like it's a little more challenging to say, well, I'm not my mind, and I can actually witness my mind. And so it's actually becoming more and more challenging to deconstruct more and more complex things, which is sort of painting a picture in the other direction. And so I guess I just wonder what you think about this. Do you think the other direction is also happening?
Yeah, no, I think they're both happening. So let's see. Yeah, so the first thing to reiterate that you noted is, well, so, Wilbur's model has the Wilber-Coombs matrix, which says it's mostly talking about contemplative state experiences, but it says you can have these state experiences regardless of what developmental level you are. What changes is how you interpret that state experience, and that depends on your worldview. So that's kind of the first articulation of this idea. And O'Fallon's taken it a step further, I think. But we can say whatever you've developed that's what you have available to deconstruct, first of all. So that's why, and the contemplative practices tend to deconstruct at the lowest levels. So you can always those levels are already there after you're 3, 4, 5 years old. So after you're whatever 10 years old, you can do practices that will deconstruct those deeper levels. The question is just, is that really what you want to do? And why would you want to deconstruct those things? I mean, at the bottom of the stack are things like time and space. They come online in some ways before even ego, and and then there's deconstructing language, which is also probably before ego in a sense. So so one thing that I'm proposing is that the lower the structure is, the more that's built up on top of it. So to sort of safely and productively deconstruct it, you have to deal with more complexity because there's just more happening on top of it. So to do it well without kind of destabilizing yourself, you have to sort of have a certain level of complexity to be able to hold what comes up. So in other words, at the green altitude and in Wilbur's model, it's amber. What does he call it? Green? No, he calls it green. Okay. Blue is amber. You can start to see yourself as a composition of subpersonalities. Okay. That's a pretty complex thing. You're looking at yourself as an ecology, and just the ability to perceive things as networked ecologies with emerging phenomena is what comes up cognitively at green. So in that sense, one can be doing various kinds of deconstruction of the ego up to orange, but it's not going to look the same as it'll look at green when you're actually able to see that I am an ecology of parts that are in conversation with each other. Yeah, right. So, and then if you start to sort of deconstruct your whole relationship with time and space and object permanence, like really serious deep meditation, you're going to have a complex world to deal with. So what level of what level of sort of maturity and complexity do you need to be able to handle that? Is kind of how that, but you can, at any level, you can practice some practice that will deconstruct your ego, or in time or space. There are specific practices that target any particular level. And there are also traumatic experiences you could run into that will confront you, or entheogens that will confront you at some of those levels. So there's not a question of there's a certain necessary order, but there's like a healthiest order I'm proposing, and that is that it's easiest to reflect on what you've more recently built up, and as you go down, it just gets more complicated to actually assimilate what comes up. So now I'm trying to relate it to the examples that you gave. I think you're right. There is something about detaching yourself from the body, but I'm not sure that that's actually the kind of a deep deconstruction. I think a lot of that is actually peeling off the neuroses and the things that get in the way of just feeling the body. So it depends on what you mean, by recovering the body. But psychotherapy, which is, not the deepest level, it's the intermediate level of you're deconstructing, what I call the social self, as opposed to the perceptual self. Um, your psychological structures are preventing you from feeling a lot of what's in your body, a lot of yourself. So I mean, I'd have to think about it more, but that's kind of where what comes up first is there's different levels of recovering your body. To fully deconstruct, you would have an experience where you literally don't feel like you have a body, like your body has no edges. And you can have that kind of experience on psychedelics or something like that, or in a trauma crash where you sort of lose all of your boundaries. But to do it in a way that sort of leads to something, more productive is a deep, to really deconstruct the body is a pretty deep dive.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That feels helpful. That feels clarifying. It seems very interesting, and like I will want to ponder that further. But I feel like that's maybe enough clarity for now. I think I see where you're going, more or less.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
like we're saying something like it seems easiest to deconstruct, to heal at the body level. And say it again. There's three things, and you said it seems more complicated to deconstruct the psyche, and even more complicated to deconstruct rationality.
So I was taking specifically the example of identifications that you would like rigid identifications that you would like identify as I am a body, I am my emotions, and rigid identifications that would not allow you to act with freedom in respect to that entity. So for example, if I am totally identified with my emotions, then I would say that I cannot act independent of my emotions. If I'm angry, I'm going to act in an angry way, and I don't have an ability to step back and say, well, I'm angry, but I'm not going to act in that way. Right. And so in that kind of a sense, it seems, I suppose it's because as you're developing up, the body sort of comes online first, and then when the emotions come online, there's something other than the body that you can view life from. There's an emotional realm, and then when there's a mental realm, you can view the emotions from the mental realm. And when there's a sort of maybe witnessing or more spiritual realm, you can view the mind from that realm, and that gives you a freedom over the previous level. So it's something like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm still putting all these pieces together, and I like challenges and crash testing the model in a bit. So right now I'm trying to make your question fit into the model. So I'm playing that game right now, but also I'm going to think about it more afterwards. But so what I can, so for example, green is getting into post-rational. So you just developed your rational self in orange or third person perspective, and then you get into fourth person perspective. And it seems like what does happen is there's kind of a natural deconstruction of that rationality, which is the most previous one. It's like, science is now cut out to be our political process, capitalism, all these like rational structures. They sort of they're the first things to deconstruct. And there's a lot of people in, progressive communities who haven't done a lot of the shadow work. And that's because that's harder. So that kind of supports, again, I'm confirmation biasing here by trying to fit it into the model, but I'm definitely, it's still in process.
That's okay. But yeah.
There could be an argument for saying it's actually harder to construct the deeper things. It's like what is my psychological makeup is, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then deconstructing things like language, the construct aware stage, fifth person perspective, it goes even, is even deeper than the social self. So
Mm, mm. I'm having the impression that there. I may change my mind about this because I'm really just playing with it in the moment. But my impression right now is that your view that you deconstruct deeper and deeper is sort of the primary challenge because it's getting more difficult, largely in that direction. But I'm also wondering if there's sort of a cleaning up or a reframing of recent experience that happens as you ascend. That is maybe also, I think you sort of spoke to this in a way when you were talking about how when you're at a level, it's like you construct something and then you sort of deconstruct the same thing, and then that ladders you up to like sort of the next level higher, and so there's like a cycling that happens sort of with the same material. So
yes.
it could be related to that.
Yeah. If you deconstruct a structure at a certain level, it loosens up, and everything that's tied to it has to. It's like the structure of a building. Everything there is a little more in flux and open to. Maybe it all falls apart, and you have this huge life-changing realization. But maybe it's just those things are a little bit looser, and they're more available to be questioned and healed also. So yeah.
Cool. All right.
Yeah, that's good. I hadn't actually thought about that part of it, so that's great.
Awesome. All right. Cool. All right. I have one more sort of open-ended philosophy question, and then we can wrap up, I think. So this one's kind of a fun one. So we're doing all of this study and thinking about development and, how we become more and more mature and more wise, more and more effective. And so one of the cool things that you can do about tracing that arc is you can kind of project it into the future. And you can say, well, if it's going this way, then maybe this is the next step. And so I'm curious, do you have any predictions for the future of human consciousness? And do you have any hopes for the future? And how do you see that we could rise to the next level using these models?
I don't have any predictions.
Okay.
But let's see. Yeah, it's like we're careening down the rapids, and what kind of boat do you want to be in? Not where's the rapids going to go, but what kind of boat do you want to be in, and who would you like to have on that boat with you? I mean, it's one way to describe this moment in history. Is similar, kind of along the lines of this framework is the rational mind has built modernity for us, and it has gotten to that point where it is shown that these structures are the faults in these structures have become ever more apparent, and we're bumping up against some ceiling that's requiring us to bring in awareness and deconstruct and release a lot of this structure. Whether or not we can do it, for any given individual person, they may or may not, do the healing that's going to make the rest of their life happy. So we don't know. A lot of exciting potential and opportunity. So it's not difficult to find the refrains of despair in where we are. But what gives me hope is that I know that at the core of every person is a basic goodness that can be recovered. And so it's okay with me if my raft going down the rapids is full of people that know their basic goodness and are helping each other get in touch with their basic goodness, and are helping people in the other rafts get in touch with their basic goodness. And for me, that's the best possible life. We're all going to die anyways, and it's like you're just kind of looking around at everybody else in the raft, and it's just like we're all in this together, and we love each other, and we found a way to do that, and because of that love and the sort of like structures we had to release to get to that place, we have our faculties intact, to sense and respond as the raft is going down in the best way that we can. So and help the other rafts. We have maximum capacity to do that. So that's the hope that I have. There's always things that we can do. I mean, the news is always bringing us the bad news, and we have to develop that capacity to find the 50%, and maybe it's 90% of every moment in reality that's really good news. To be able to face the challenges without constricting and limiting our options. So
awesome. That feels hopeful. I like that.
I feel hopeful.
Yeah.
I just have no idea whether we're gonna. I'm hopeful because people are good. Underneath it all, people are good, and people that I have in my life, fortunately for me, show that goodness. It's not hard to see that in them. So, and that's possible living in most contexts, I think. And there's a lot of work for us to do together as well.
Yeah, I like that you captured the hope and the danger of the rapids, the dangerous excitement of the rapids in that analogy. That was cool. Well,
yeah, and I'll just also add the suffering. When we look at each other and we're on the rapid, there's the acknowledgement of the predicament that we're in as well. It's not just a fun ride.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think these are valuable tools to help us on our challenging and engaging ride down the river. So thank you so much for a really interesting conversation. I very much enjoyed this. And before we go, I just want to give you the opportunity to share with the audience, like, is there anything you'd like people to check out? I know you are working on a new website project. I don't know, is there anything you'd like to share? TomMurray.us will get you to my projects and publications. I'm spending most of my time these days working with Stages International and all of their research and courses and assessment stuff, and that's going really well. So you can check out Stages International, check out my website, and awesome. Don't spend too much time on the internet. All right, very good.
Actually, you and I met at dance camp.
We did.
I'll see you back on the dance floor at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you again, and have a beautiful day.
You too, Ryan. Thank you.